So now that we talked about the different mechanisms of evolution and how populations can kind of change over time, we can get into how we define one population from another. How do we determine basically what a species is? So you may be familiar with the word species, but not necessarily know exactly what that means, just knowing that maybe it's like some sort of category. But there are a few ways we can define species. One of those is called the biological species concept, which basically says a population of organisms are the same species if they are capable of interbreeding under natural conditions and do not interbreed or cannot interbreed with organisms in other groups. So basically we're looking at, can they and do they reproduce together? Now, before we get too far into species and speciation, we want to make sure we understand how do we categorize things in the first place. So every species on Earth has a particular genus species combo that we use to identify them. And so we're going to look at a zebra here, and we look at the different categories for organizing life. We go from the very top, this is going to be the most inclusive, and the very bottom, which is the most exclusive. So in domain, we have bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. We're looking at a zebra, so they're going to be domain eukarya. But within eukarya, we're including all of the eukaryotic cells. So all animals, all plants, all fungi, so on, and protists, and so on and so forth. So everything that's a eukaryotic cell is included in domain eukarya. But a zebra is an animal, not a protist, not a plant, not a fungus. So we go down to the next level of kingdom, and we go to kingdom Animalia, which is all of the animals. And so we're getting a little more exclusive in that we're excluding fungus, excluding plant, excluding protist. Since this is a chordate, meaning we have a vertebral column, we have basically a spine, then we become phylum Chordata. So it's one of many phylums in Animalia, but we're eliminating all of the invertebrates basically. So we're in Chordata, but we want to get a little more specific. Zebras are a mammal, so we move down to class Mammalia, excluding all of the other animals, so excluding birds, excluding reptiles, things like that. And then we go down to the order Perissodactyla, which is getting more narrow, down to family Equidae, which is looking at kind of like horse-like organisms. And then finally we get to the genus Equus and Quagga for species. So Equus quagga is going to be our species for this zebra. So at this point, we're excluding everything that's not a zebra at this very bottom layer. And so this is going to be our way of identifying a species, basically saying all the members of this Equus quagga group are able to reproduce together, and they don't reproduce with anyone else in nature. Now, occasionally you do have some species who cross over and form what we call a hybrid. However, the reason why we would not call the hybrid a new species is because a lot of times these hybrids are sterile. And so because they're sterile, they can't reproduce, we would not give them a new species name. We would just call them a hybrid because they're never going to reproduce on their own. So a good example of a hybrid that is not its own species would be like a mule. A mule is a cross between a donkey and a horse. Donkeys and horses are two separate species. They are capable of creating offspring, the mule. However, those mules are sterile. So a mule and a mule cannot have a baby, and so we would not call a mule a new species because they're a genetic dead end, basically. We do use specific naming to categorize species, and it's really focused on the genus and the species epithet. So, for example, humans, we are Homo sapiens. Dogs, Canis familiaris. Cats are Felis domesticus. Corn, Zaemes. And boa constrictor, well, is boa constrictor. But we always see a two-part name. The first part that is capitalized is the genus, and then the lowercase second part is the species. So you can have like Homo erectus, which is another human-like species that used to exist. They would be in the same genus as us, the same kind of category, but not the same species, right? So the second part really gives us the specific nature of that population. So a genus, right, is kind of like the generic group for them, has many species, and the genus name will always be capitalized, but the specific part, the species epithet, is lowercase. Sometimes when you're writing the species name on paper, underline it, because if you're typing it, you write it in italics. As you go on those steps, like I mentioned, the higher you go on that list, the more inclusive, and the lower you go on that list, the more exclusive. When it comes to figuring out what name to give species, it's really the rights of the person or persons who found it. And so sometimes you'll see, you know, some senses of humor when naming organisms. A lot of these organisms are named after the person who found them. So you'll see some species names and you're like, what the heck is that? And it's because of it's named after the last name of the person who found it. But also, especially in recent years, people are getting a little bit more creative and fun with their naming of species that they find. So there's like an insect that's named after Beyonce. I think there's a hornet or a wasp that's named after Dementors from Harry Potter. There's a lot of various species names out there that are kind of silly, but the reason why those names exist in that format is because whoever finds it, right, whoever discovers it, gets the naming rights. But if we look at full classification, because the genus, species, epithet is like the shortened version. If we get the full classification, we're going from domain all the way down. So for humans, we would be domain Eukarya, then Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, Primates, Hominidae, Homo, and then Homo sapiens. So as humans, we love patterns. We like to be able to compartmentalize things and categorize things. That's one of the things we like to do as people. But the problem is that species are really hard to classify. And so with the biological species concept, you have to have organisms that can reproduce sexually, right? Because we're looking at interbreeding populations. And so the biological species concept is a little bit limited because it's focused on reproductive habits. So what happens if you have two populations that are found on the other side of the planet, but if they happen to be near each other, they would and could reproduce? What happens with things like bacteria that are asexually reproducing? They don't even need a second partner. How do we categorize them? So there are some weaknesses to the biological species concept, and so there's another concept of defining species that is easier to use in the field, and that's the morphological species concept. And this is basically going off of physical features rather than reproductive habits. So we're looking at how do they look, how do they act, right? What are the physical and what are the things that we can observe as we're looking at this species? So that's another one. There are a few others, including like the phylogenetic species concept. The term species is a little bit, I don't want to say loose, but it's not as constricted, it's not as strictly defined as some people think. Now, as terms of how many species are on the planet, we don't really know that for sure. The current estimate is about 8.7 million, where we've identified 1.3 million of those and given them some sort of classification. And what we're seeing is that, or what we know, is that you can have one species and it can split into more than one. This is the process called speciation, where you have one species and it splits into two distinct groups. There are a couple of requirements in order for speciation to happen. You have to have reproductive isolation, so they cannot reproduce together. You cannot kind of mix up the two groups' gene pools. And you need to see that they genetically become different from each other over time. That eventually, given enough time, enough generations, they will look genetically different as an entire group. Now, there are two forms of speciation that are basically kind of wrap around whether or not there is some sort of geographic change. If there is geographic change, we call it allopatric speciation. And if there is no geographic change, we call it sympatric speciation. We see that sympatric speciation is common in plants, not so much in animals, because animals can move around to reproduce. So let's look back at like what a species is and kind of why the biological species concept has some weaknesses. It is pretty useful. It's not completely useless. We still use it to some degree, but it does have weaknesses just like any of these concepts that we're looking at. It doesn't really allow you to classify asexual species because it focuses on interbreeding, which asexual reproduction involves no interbreeding. It's hard to classify fossils. We don't know whether or not there was reproductive isolation between individuals when we find bones. So fossils usually go off of morphological, just because we don't have the information we need to use the biological species concept to identify them that way. It's also hard to determine using this concept when one species has changed into another. The issue with a species in general, and this comes down to the species concept in general, is that a species is a finite, like, determined, discrete measurement, right? We put you in this box or that box. But in nature, change is more gradual, and so it's more of a long-term transition rather than you are this species and the next generation is suddenly a different species. It's more of a gradual change. It also makes it really difficult to kind of figure out where one species ends and another begins when you have interbreeding. So for example, we might see like this ring species where purple here cannot interbreed with green, but purple can interbreed with blue, and blue can interbreed with green. And so there's really no one point where one species stops and the other begins. We just see that these two cannot interbreed. But if this guy can interbreed with this guy and this guy can interbreed with that guy, I mean, that makes it a little more complicated to define. And then hybridizing. We talked about hybrids and how like a lot of hybrids produce sterile offspring, but not always. A good example is polar bears and grizzly bears. Polar bears and grizzly bears are identified as separate species, and yet they can reproduce and produce offspring that are viable, that survive and reproduce on their own. And so how do you justify that separate species naming system when they have the ability to interbreed? So the biological species concept wouldn't really work there, simply because the hybrids are viable and they are fertile. Now let's get into the types of speciation. Now remember, allopatric speciation was geographic isolation. So basically we have this population of rodents. They're all teal. Something happens, a river forms between, through these squirrels. And so this population gets split into two. Because they cannot get from one side of the river to the other, they now can only mate with the individuals from their side of the river. So they're reproductively isolated. And so over time, you'll see that genetic differences will accumulate, and the differences on this side are going to be different from the differences on that side. So for example, if this river, let's say these squirrels were living in like around the edge of a forest and a meadow, and a river comes through dividing the forest from the meadow. We might see that on the meadow side, certain traits like burrowing and whatnot are more beneficial, and so we see that they start to burrow. Maybe they have some different fur colors involved. Maybe they have to have different body size or whatever based on the predators found in the meadow. And then on the forest side, maybe they become tree dwellers. Maybe their fur color changes so that they are better off blending into the trees. Maybe they develop different traits in response to different predators found in the forest only. And so we see that they become different colors in this case, right, from teal to blue and yellow, in response to that reproductive isolation, right? The reproductive isolation, each side of the river will have slightly different selective pressures, leading each population to diverge from the original. And so eventually, if this river disappeared, or if humans built a bridge over this river or something like that, if enough time has passed and they've become genetically different enough, then even though they have contact with each other again, they might not even be able to reproduce anymore, simply because genetically they've become just that different.